Why has it taken you this long to say anything plainly?
Months earlier, Iris reached Redstone homeless, penniless with a mountain storm closing in. Widowed rancher Ambrose found her soaked and alone on the northern road.
My ranch is not hiring before spring.
May I sleep in your barn tonight? I can work for the shelter.
He offered a room. She worked through the storm, refusing charity. Soon, her skill and dignity warmed his 8-year silent house. But their 34-year age gap frightened him. Dependence frightened her. Then, another ranch offered Iris a safer, respectable future. With one letter between them, everything remained unsaid. It began on that rain-soaked road in 1890. Redstone, New Mexico Territory, 1890. There is a particular kind of solitude that settles into a man who has spent decades building something substantial entirely on his own terms. And Ambrose Kettering had lived inside that solitude for 8 years, ever since his wife Beatrice died of a fever that took her in a single terrible week. He was 58 years old, broad and weathered from 4 decades of ranch work, his hair and beard gone fully gray, his hands scarred and capable in the particular way of a man who had built his own operation from a modest homestead into one of the largest cattle ranches in the territory. He ran nearly 5,000 acres north of Redstone, employed a dozen hands through the busy seasons, and had earned, over the years, a reputation throughout 3 counties for fair dealing and quiet, steady competence. What he had not built in 8 years of trying was any particular interest in filling the considerable quiet that had settled into his house since Beatrice's passing. His days ran early and orderly, dawn rides checking fence lines and stock, long hours of practical ranch business, evenings spent alone at a kitchen table that had once seated 2. And now, more often than not, seated only his own considering silence. He had raised no children, a private grief he rarely spoke of, and the ranch itself had become, in the years since Beatrice died, both his livelihood and his whole remaining purpose, the two so thoroughly intertwined that Ambrose himself had largely stopped distinguishing between them. Redstone sat in a wide valley beneath red sandstone bluffs that gave the town its name, a modest but steadily growing settlement with a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and a main street. Ambrose traveled perhaps twice a month for supplies, preferring the considerable solitude of his own land to the town's regular commotion. He was well regarded throughout the territory, trusted for his fair dealing and his honest word, but the town had long since settled into treating his solitary habits as simply a permanent fact about the man, the way one accepted a hard winter or a stubborn fence line, something to be respected rather than questioned. Iris Wexford was 24 years old and had spent the better part of that autumn walking the territorial roads between towns. Her family's small homestead lost the previous spring to drought and bad debt that had taken everything her parents spent 15 years building. Her mother dead 2 years prior, and her father unable to properly recover from the loss of both wife and land in such close succession, having taken work on a distant cattle drive that left Iris entirely on her own. She had light red hair, worn practical and often escaping whatever knot she managed each morning, bright and coppery despite the road dust that had become a near-permanent feature of her appearance, and wore a light blue dress considerably worn from months of constant wear, though she kept it as clean and mended as her circumstances allowed. She carried herself with a quiet, determined dignity that had not yet been fully worn away by her difficult circumstances, though the exhaustion of the road showed plainly in her face by the time this particular story properly began. Her mother, before her death, used to tell Iris that dignity was the one possession poverty could never actually take from a person, provided that person refused to surrender it willingly, an instruction Iris had carried through the hardest months of her family's decline and had clung to fiercely, even as nearly everything else had been stripped away by circumstances entirely beyond her control. It was in late October, with an early season storm rolling down hard and cold off the mountains, that Iris found herself walking the territorial road north of Redstone toward what she hoped might be steady work at a ranch she had heard through travelers' gossip might be hiring. The rain building over several miles into a genuine downpour that soaked through her thin coat entirely and left her cold and increasingly desperate as darkness began settling early under the storm's heavy clouds. Ambrose, returning from a business errand in Redstone, saw her first as a small, struggling figure on the roadside ahead, and slowed his team without particularly deciding to, some old instinct toward basic decency overriding whatever preference he might otherwise have had for simply continuing on toward his own dry house and warm fire. "You are soaked clean through," he observed, drawing the wagon alongside her. "I am aware," she said, exhaustion and a certain wary pride both evident in the brief reply. "Where are you headed in this?" he asked, unable to simply drive past a young woman alone on an increasingly dangerous road. "North," she said. "I heard there might be work at a ranch some miles up this road." "That would be my ranch you heard about," he said, "and I can tell you plainly there is no hiring happening in weather like this, nor likely before spring." She absorbed that with visible, carefully controlled disappointment, and Ambrose, watching her weigh whatever difficult calculation came next, found himself doing some difficult calculating of his own. "Climb up," he said before he had fully decided to make the offer. "I am not in the habit of leaving a person stranded on an open road in conditions like these." She hesitated, the particular wariness of someone who had learned, through hard recent experience, that kindness from strangers sometimes came with complications she could not afford. But the storm made the decision easier than pride alone might have allowed, and she climbed up beside him. "Iris Wexford," she said once they were moving, "and I am considerably more grateful for this wagon than my manners have properly shown." They rode until Ambrose's ranch house came into view, warm lamplight visible through the rain, and Iris, studying the substantial operation with careful calculation, finally spoke the request that would become the whole hinge of everything that followed. "May I sleep in your barn tonight?" she asked, plain and direct. "I do not need charity beyond that, Mr. Kettering. I can work for the shelter, mend anything that needs mending, muck stalls, whatever honest labor the arrangement requires. I simply cannot walk further in this storm, and I have no coin for a proper room in town." Ambrose considered the request a long moment, this young woman who had walked considerable miles in genuine danger rather than surrender whatever pride remained to her. "You will sleep in the house," he said. "The barn is no fit place for a person in weather like this, and I have rooms standing entirely empty." "I would not want to impose," she said, the wariness returning. "You are not imposing," he said. "You are accepting the plain hospitality any decent person would extend, and I would ask you to grant me the dignity of being that decent person rather than making me argue you into a warm bed instead of a cold barn." That should have been the whole of it. A stranded traveler sheltered from a genuine autumn storm, the kind of plain necessary hospitality any decent rancher might extend. Except that the storm kept up through the whole of that night and well into the following day, making the road genuinely treacherous for travel. And Iris, true to her word, spent that stranded day working alongside Ambrose's household staff with a genuine, determined competence that surprised him considerably, mending torn linens with a skill that spoke of real training, helping the cook manage a kitchen short-handed by the weather, working with a diligence that made clear she had meant every word about earning her keep rather than accepting simple charity. "I did not expect you to actually work through a storm you were sheltering from," Ambrose observed, finding her still busy with mending well into the evening. "I said I would earn my keep," she said, not looking up from her work. "I generally mean what I say, Mr. Kettering." He found himself, watching her work with that particular determined focus, genuinely curious about a young woman who apparently valued her own word considerably more than her own comfort, and the conversation that followed that evening, over a shared supper, neither of them had particularly planned, stretched considerably longer than either had expected, Iris speaking, with careful reluctance at first and then with growing openness, of her family's lost homestead and her father's distant work, and the considerable uncertainty that had defined her recent months. Ambrose listening with a genuine attention he had not much practiced with anybody in the 8 years since Beatrice's death. Once the storm finally broke, Iris made ready to continue her journey the following morning, gathering her few dried belongings with the same quiet dignity she had carried throughout, and Ambrose found himself watching her prepare to leave, doing considerable internal arguing with an impulse he had not expected to feel. "You mentioned my ranch does no hiring until spring," she said by way of goodbye, though there was something searching in the observation that suggested she was not entirely finished with the conversation. "That is generally true," he said, "though I find myself reconsidering the general rule, given the particular circumstances." "What circumstances would those be?" she asked, careful now, unwilling to presume too much from a night's shelter and a shared supper. "The circumstance of a young woman who mends linens better than anybody currently in my employ, and who apparently values her own word considerably more than her own comfort," he said. "I could use exactly that kind of reliable help around the house through the winter months if you would consider staying on properly, rather than continuing toward uncertain prospects further north." She considered the offer a long moment, weighing it with the same careful calculation she had brought to every difficult decision this particular story had so far required of her, and finally accepted, recognizing in the practical arrangement exactly the kind of dignified, earned position her mother's old instruction would have approved of entirely. That winter settled into a genuine working rhythm neither of them had fully anticipated, Iris managing the household's mending and considerable domestic organization with a competence that quickly made her indispensable. Ambrose finding, week over week, that his own long, solitary evenings had transformed, almost without his properly noticing the transformation, into genuine shared conversation over supper, the particular comfortable quiet of two people who had settled into easy, unhurried company. "You did not have to hire me on properly," Iris told him some weeks into the arrangement, having noticed that the wages he paid her considerably exceeded what the actual work strictly required. "I know," he said. "Seemed a foolish thing to let good, honest help go wanting when I had both the position and the considerable need for exactly that kind of reliability." Ambrose, in turn, began noticing things about Iris's own remaining circumstances, the fact that her only proper coat, the one she had been wearing that first storm-soaked evening, had never been properly replaced despite months of honest wages, and he arranged without much comment for a new winter coat to arrive from the mercantile, left simply on her bed with no note attached, no acknowledgement expected. "I know you did not have to do that either," she told him the morning she found the new coat. "I know," he said, echoing her own words back at her with something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "Seemed a foolish thing to let a hard-working woman go cold through a proper New Mexico winter when I had the means to prevent it easily enough." He kept an old ranch dog named Duchess, who had shared his considerable solitude faithfully through most of those 8 lonely years, and Duchess took to Iris with an immediacy that surprised even Ambrose, the old dog abandoning her usual spot by his own chair to instead follow Iris through her daily household rounds, as though the animal had already settled a question the two humans were still working through separately. The town noticed, the way small towns invariably notice everything eventually. Mrs. Cornelia Ashcroft, who ran the mercantile, remarked to her husband that Ambrose Kettering had taken to visiting town rather more frequently than his usual habits generally allowed, and old Cyrus Bramwell, who had known Ambrose for decades and ran the neighboring spread, observed that the Kettering ranch house had taken on a considerably livelier character than it had shown in the 8 years since Beatrice's passing. Ambrose told himself he was simply grateful for genuinely competent household help after 8 years of managing everything alone, the plain practical relief of finally having reliable domestic order. Iris told herself she was simply doing honest work for fair wages, nothing more complicated than good employment properly earned. Neither explanation held up especially well under close examination, but neither of them examined it too closely, because the examining threatened to surface something both had reasons to leave carefully alone. Ambrose's fear, when he finally sat with it honestly one evening after Iris had retired for the night, wore the exact shape 8 years of solitary habit had built for it. He was 58 years old, 34 years Iris's senior, a settled widower who had spent the better part of a decade believing his own capacity for close attachment had been buried alongside Beatrice, and he told himself that whatever warmth had grown between them belonged strictly to the category of employers' gratitude for genuinely reliable help, that a young woman still building her own uncertain future deserved considerably more than attaching herself to an aging rancher who had already proven, through 8 years of evidence, that solitude suited him better than partnership ever had. Iris's own fear wore a quieter, more practical shape. She had arrived at Ambrose's ranch with nothing beyond her own dignity and her willingness to work honestly for whatever shelter that dignity could properly earn, and she wondered, privately, whether letting herself want considerably more than honest employment from a man who had rescued her from a genuine storm might read, to anyone watching, as exactly the kind of calculated dependency her mother's old instruction had warned her against, trading her hard-won independence for comfortable attachment rather than genuinely earning her own way forward. It was around this time that a respectable young rancher from a neighboring county, having heard through mutual acquaintances of Iris's considerable domestic skill, began making formal inquiries about her availability for a proper household position at his own family's operation, an offer that represented, by every practical measure, a more conventional situation than her current arrangement with a widower considerably her senior. I want to pause the story here for just a moment, because this is exactly the point where a woman who arrived with nothing but her own dignity has to weigh whether accepting a more conventional position might finally offer her the stable, uncomplicated future her difficult recent months had taught her to value above nearly everything else. Iris had spent months insisting to herself that what she felt for Ambrose was simple gratitude for genuine rescue. She was about to discover exactly how much that insistence cost her, watching it nearly send her toward a considerably safer, more conventional arrangement than the one that had actually, quietly, become her genuine home. If you have been enjoying this story tonight, I would love to know whereabouts in the world you are joining us from. Whether that is somewhere across the United States, up in Canada, over in the United Kingdom or Australia, or anywhere else this old story happens to have traveled tonight. Do drop your country down in the comments below. It genuinely means a great deal to us to see how far these tales reach. Now, let us get back to Redstone, because Ambrose Kettering is about to discover whether 8 years of careful solitude can survive one honest conversation. Ambrose heard of the neighboring rancher's inquiry through his own household channels and spent several days turning the matter over with a discomfort that surprised him considerably. Arriving finally at a conclusion he found himself entirely unwilling to accept, that watching Iris depart for a more conventional position represented a loss. His own careful solitude had no adequate language left to properly explain. He found her in the kitchen one evening, reviewing the neighboring rancher's formal letter. "I heard about the inquiry from over in Hartwell County," he said, foregoing any pretense of routine evening business. "Word travels fast on a ranch this size," she said, setting the letter aside. "I've spent months telling myself I was simply grateful for reliable help," he said. "And in those months, nothing has once made me want to argue with that story, until I saw that letter sitting there and felt something considerably less professional than gratitude." "Ambrose," she said, careful, her voice dropping quieter than her usual brisk manner, "why has it taken you this long to say anything plainly?" He was quiet a long moment, the kitchen settling around them in the evening lamplight. "Because I built my whole existence, these past 8 years, around the belief that solitude suited me better than close attachment ever had," he finally said, plain in a way that cost him visibly. "I watched you walk into a storm with nothing but your own dignity, and I have spent months since watching that same dignity build something in this house I had genuinely stopped believing myself capable of wanting again." The kitchen held very still, evening settling fully across the whole ranch house. Iris looked at him a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to something close to a whisper, the particular quiet reserved for words too important for anything louder. "I asked to sleep in your barn that first night, because I could not afford to owe anybody anything I could not properly repay," she whispered. "I have spent months since watching you refuse to let that particular pride go unhonored, paying me fairly, asking nothing beyond honest work in return, and I find myself considerably more interested in what we have actually built here than in whatever more conventional arrangement Hartwell County might offer." "Is that an answer?" he asked, needing the plain word. "It is considerably more than an answer," she said, the smallest true smile finding her mouth. "It is a home, Ambrose, if you are asking whether I have found one. I stopped looking further the moment you insisted I take a proper bed instead of your barn." Ambrose Kettering, 58 years old, and certain that very evening that solitude was simply the permanent shape his remaining years were meant to take, crossed the small distance of his own kitchen and kissed her, careful at first, the way a man approaches anything he has spent nearly a decade convincing himself he no longer deserved, and then considerably less careful. While somewhere nearby, Duchess thumped her tail against the floorboards in unmistakable approval. Word moved through Redstone with predictable speed once their courtship became evident. Mrs. Ashcroft declared she had suspected it since the winter coat arrived. The Hartwell County rancher, informed that Iris intended to decline his offer, expressed genuine surprise but reasonable grace, and old Cyrus Bramwell claimed with evident satisfaction that he had known it the moment Duchess abandoned her usual spot for Iris's household rounds. They married that following spring, in a small ceremony at the Redstone Church, with a considerable portion of the county in attendance, curiosity about the territory's most notable widower finally settling, drawing a crowd considerably larger than either of them had expected. Iris wore light blue rather than any traditional bridal white, having decided that a woman ought to be married in whatever genuinely suited her rather than whatever convention demanded, and she looked, standing at the front of that small church with the whole county watching, exactly as striking as Ambrose had quietly believed since that first storm-soaked evening he found her walking the territorial road. His hands, steady enough for 4 decades of hard ranch work, trembled slightly saying his vows, a fact Iris would tease him about gently for years afterward. And when it came his turn to speak beyond the standard words, he told her plainly that he had spent 8 years believing solitude suited him better than partnership, and that she had proven, one earned wage and one refused barn at a time, that a man could be entirely wrong about his own settled assessment of his own remaining years. Old Cyrus Bramwell, watching from a pew near the back, was overheard remarking afterward that he had never once witnessed a courtship conducted so thoroughly through mended linens and a stubborn dog's shifted loyalty, and doubted he ever would again. A sentiment several fellow ranchers echoed as the whole small church settled into the particular warm commotion that follows any wedding a county has watched unfold slowly, one earned kindness at a time. Their first year together settled into a rhythm neither of them had fully expected, the ranch house finally filled with the ordinary noise of genuine shared life rather than solitary quiet, Iris's practical competence and Ambrose's decades of accumulated experience combining into a household considerably more prosperous and considerably livelier than either had managed separately, meals now shared rather than eaten in solitary silence at opposite ends of a long, quiet table. He built her a proper sewing room that first autumn, sized and lit exactly to the mending and household work she had first proven herself through, because he had noticed, without her mentioning it twice, precisely what her considerable skill needed, framing the whole addition himself over several careful weeks once the autumn roundup work eased, consulting her only on where the light fell best through the afternoon. Mrs. Ashcroft took to remarking at the Mercantile that the Kettering ranch house had never looked so genuinely lived in, a compliment that reached Iris second-hand and settled something in her that months of Ambrose's own steady reassurance had only partly managed, the particular relief of hearing from an outside voice that the life she was building had visibly, genuinely improved the household rather than simply occupying space within it. It was not without its harder moments. That following winter, Ambrose's own health gave him a genuine scare, a bout of pneumonia that laid him up for nearly a month and reminded them both, uncomfortably, of exactly the fever that had taken both his own first wife and Iris's own mother, the parallel too sharp for either of them to properly ignore during his worst feverish nights. Iris found herself, watching him through the worst of that illness, terrified by a fear she had never quite let herself name fully, that she had built her whole hard-won new life around a man whose years, by simple, honest arithmetic, could not match her own indefinitely, a fear that kept her sitting bedside through his worst fevered nights long after the household staff had retired. Ambrose, once well enough to properly discuss it, did not brush past the fear. He told her plainly that he could not promise her decades beyond what any honest man his age could promise, but that he would spend whatever years remained choosing her fully, every single day, rather than taking a single one for granted. And Iris, hearing him choose honest presence over false reassurance, found the fear easing into something she could carry rather than something that carried her. By spring, his strength fully returned. He took to walking the fence lines each morning, specifically so she could watch him do it from the kitchen window, a small daily reassurance neither of them ever properly discussed, but both plainly understood. And Iris found herself watching him grow steadily stronger through the following months, slowly releasing the particular clenched fear she'd carried through the worst of his illness. 2 years passed, and on a bright October afternoon, almost exactly to the day since Ambrose had first found her walking the storm-soaked territorial road, Iris stood on the ranch house porch, their young daughter Beatrice Rose, coppery-haired like her mother, perched on her hip and reaching toward the approaching rain clouds with delighted, fearless hands. Old Duchess, gray about the muzzle now and considerably slower on her feet, still kept her post near the porch steps most afternoons, one ear perpetually cocked toward whichever direction Iris's voice happened to be coming from. "Storm's building again," Ambrose said, coming up from the barn, glancing at the same darkening sky that had first brought them together, his own gait steady and sure, despite the previous winter's scare, Duchess trailing slowly behind him. "It is," Iris said, smiling warmly, "though I believe I have a considerably warmer bed waiting this time than a barn floor." "You never did properly thank me for refusing to let you sleep in that barn," he said, coming to stand beside her, resting a hand lightly on the porch railing they had rebuilt together the previous summer. "I believe I have spent 2 years thanking you for it in considerably more thorough fashion than words alone could manage," she said, and he laughed, the particular easy sound that had become, over 2 years, as familiar to the ranch house as the wind against its own sturdy walls. "I want to stop here for just a moment before we close this story out, because I believe there is something in it worth sitting with tonight. We often assume that dignity and dependency exist in permanent opposition, that a person who has lost everything must choose between prideful isolation and humiliating charity, with no honest middle ground genuinely available between those two difficult extremes. But Iris Wexford's simple, direct request that first stormy evening, asking plainly to work for shelter rather than simply accepting it, revealed something considerably wiser than either extreme, that dignity and genuine need can coexist honestly when both parties involved insist on fair, mutual exchange rather than either charity or exploitation. There is a particular kind of courage in asking for help while still insisting on paying your own way through it, and Iris carried that courage through the whole of that first difficult evening, refusing the easy comfort of simple charity even when exhaustion and genuine danger would have excused accepting it without further argument. Ambrose, for his part, showed a quieter but equally important courage, recognizing that her insistence on earning her shelter was not stubbornness to be overridden, but dignity to be properly honored, and building their entire relationship from that first night forward around genuine mutual respect rather than rescue. Ambrose's refusal to let her sleep in a cold barn, his insistence on paying her properly rather than simply housing her, and Iris's own steady determination to earn every kindness she eventually accepted, together built something considerably sturdier than either simple rescue or simple gratitude could have managed alone. Sometimes the truest partnerships begin exactly where this one did, in a storm, with an honest request for shelter, and grow strongest precisely because both people involved insisted, from that very first difficult evening, on genuine mutual respect, rather than either person owing the other something neither could properly repay. Thank you so much for spending this hour with Ambrose and Iris tonight, wherever in this wide world you happen to be listening from. I would love to know down in the comments, were you rooting for them from that very first request to sleep in the barn? Or did it take you a little longer to trust that this particular kind of earned partnership was the real thing? If this story kept you good company this evening, a like on this video and a subscribe to the channel mean a great deal to us and cost you nothing at all. And if you know someone who might need a quiet, gentle hour like this one, please do consider passing it along to them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope somebody stops for you in whatever storm you are currently walking through. Until next time, keep riding.